Welcome to our listeners. Today I'm thrilled to be talking to Dr. Julie Bernath and Dr. Katrin Travouillon, who have a new article in the Review of International Studies entitled Time to Break Up with the International Community, Rhetoric or Realities of a Political Myth in Cambodia. Julie is a senior researcher and program officer at Swiss Peace and a visiting researcher at the Center for Conflict Studies at the University of Marburg. And Katrin is a lecturer in the Department of Political and Social Change at the Australian National University. A very warm welcome to you both and congratulations on the article.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Let me start by asking you both to tell us a little bit about your academic journeys. How did you end up becoming interested in this area and what brought the two of you together? Should we start with you, Julie?
Yes. Thank you very much. And first also from both of us, thanks for this very nice opportunity to present our work in this format. So actually the article is the result of us coming together after having conducted research on two separate and consecutive UN interventions or missions in Cambodia. So for my side, I have after having spent quite some time in Cambodia, I joined the Peace Research Institute Swiss Peace at the University of Basel to conduct research on the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, which is also known as the ECCC or the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. And this hybrid tribunal was established in 2004 after protracted negotiations between the United Nations and the royal government of Cambodia, with the mandate to try the most responsible and senior leaders for the crimes committed under the Khmer Rouge regime from 75 to 79. And so I had previously also worked and interned at the tribunal. And so I had become interested about the politics of this transitional justice process and also its relevance for survivors of the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia. And so whilst I was doing field research and interviews with UN appointed international staff members at the tribunal and Cambodian staff members, as well as civil society actors and survivors of the Khmer Rouge regime who were participating in the proceedings. So during these interviews in the capital city and in various provinces in the country, many respondents referred to the previous UN intervention that had happened in Cambodia about a decade before the tribunal was established. And they often framed their expectations towards the role of the United Nations at the tribunal in relation to this previous UN peacebuilding mission. And so this is exactly what Katrin's research was about at that point.
Very interesting. And Katrin, can you also tell us?
Sure, of course. So in my case, I actually joined the Center for Conflict Studies in Marburg back in 2010. And my role at the time was that of a lead investigator on a study on the UN Transitional Authority in Cambodia. So usually it's being referred to as UNTAC in a short way. It's an intervention that took place in the early 90s, so 92, 93 to be exact. And actually already prior to this appointment, I had spent a lot of time in Cambodia, had already started to learn the language. And really much of my work ever since has been dedicated to tracing how this intervention has impacted on politics in Cambodia. So initially in my work, what I did was I focused on archival documents. So I spent, for instance, a lot of time in the Radio UNTAC archive, the University of Wisconsin-Madison. But there was also a number of other archives. So in the US, in France, in Cambodia, of course. What I also did later on was I started to track down both domestic actors and international actors who had participated in the mission. I was really interested in how the Cambodian elite at the time, how did they present this new order and this new vision of what was called a liberal multi-party democracy in Cambodia to the Cambodian people, and how they responded to this vision. So I'd say that our project actually on the international community, it goes back interestingly to a lunch break at the International Studies Association's conference in Atlanta in 2016. So we had a colleague of ours who said, oh, I know about your work. And he suggested we should meet and talk. And he said, you have a lot to talk about, I'm sure. And Yeah, we have always joked about how he was very right, because 4 years later we're still talking. So that was very good as an advice. So what we did at this first meeting was initially talk about our experience in interviewing Cambodian actors and how often we are actually perceived as representatives of the international community. So the kind of expectations that carries it with it. And later on, what we moved on to discuss was the centrality of this concept in more general terms. So the fact that domestic actors, but also international actors, they seem to have extremely strong opinions about the international community and its role in political change in Cambodia. So there was this notion that it was clearly assigned with a powerful impact on political change. And well, yeah, this is what we wanted to understand better, the political effects of this and the expectations. That was the start of this project.
How interesting. Julie, could you go, moving on to the article, can you give us just a quick sort of outline of what it's about?
Yes, thank you. So the article is organized around one central research puzzle. Why do Cambodian actors and activists with a progressive political agenda express skepticism today towards the international community, when these actors are precisely those whom one could assume would embrace what the international community supposedly stands for: liberal values, human rights, democracy? And so starting from this empirical observation, we engage with the extensive literature in international relations on the notion of international community. And so in this literature, there are two dominant approaches, one could say. First, the international community stands for liberal norms and universal values. And second, the international community is mobilized strategically or instrumentally to gain an advantage. And so neither of these approaches, we felt, could actually help us to explain why actors committed to fight for human rights and democratic change have these conflicting feelings towards the international community. And so in response, we turned to work by constructivist scholars, for example, Berit Blizeman de Guevara and Florian Kuhn's work on the international community. And finally, also Chiara Bottici's work on political myth. And so this allowed us to develop an approach to study the idea of the international community empirically in its concrete political context. And so in our paper, we're not trying to analyze the successes or failures of specific interventions of those actors that are most often associated with the notion of the international community. So multilateral organizations such as the UN or specific Western countries. And in fact, this is actually already widely done in academic policy and public debates on Cambodia. And instead, with this constructivist approach, what we're trying to do is to take one step back and to ask, well, how has the notion of the international community been used in Cambodia over time? And what are the political effects of this specific use of the notion of the international community for by now 30 years for conceptualizations of political change in Cambodia today? And so our analysis traces how actors assign the international community with different actions and ideas over time. And we do so through looking at three contexts over time in Cambodia. First, we look at UNTAC, the UN peacebuilding intervention of the early 1990s, and how both UN officials and also Cambodian political actors first assigned the international community with agentic properties. And second, we analyze how this narrative has been reinforced over time through legal aid and development interventions. And finally, we examine how it is used today in a post-liberal context. And so this allows us to solve our research puzzle. Actors have conflicting feelings about the international community as a result of these concrete experiences they have made in engaging with this idea over time. And so it is important to emphasize that the progressive actors we interviewed do not question liberal values or ideas, but they question the terms of cooperation that were dictated by liberal interventionism. So what they challenge is to what extent this vision of cooperation and change can still provide the ideas and the guidance necessary to deal with the challenges they face in Cambodia today.
Okay, thank you, Julie. Katrin, you say that you conceptualize the international community as a political myth. Can you elaborate on that? And what exactly is mythical about the international community?
Yeah, thank you. Well, commonly, people think about falsehoods when they hear the term myth. And we want to emphasize that this is not at all what we want to present when we conceptualize the international community as a political myth. So Julie has already pointed out, we're not really interested in the so-called failures or successes of the international community. And as such, we also don't propose to state that the international community is mythical because of its perceived failures, because it didn't live up to these standards. So rather, we are really interested in the emergence of this idea. So the ways in which the international community is collaboratively assigned with meaning, and then how these particular ideas come to shape certain actors' agendas, how they benefit some and undermine others in often quite unexpected ways. So what our article does, it works with a very specific concept of political myths, namely that by Bernath Bottici. So what her approach allowed us was to tackle directly what's quite puzzling about the international community, namely the fact that it's simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. So there is work by Katarzyna Kaczmarska, who shows that quite beautifully. She analyzes the UN Millennium documents, and then by tracing how they circulate in public discourse, she can show that the international community is seemingly the instigator of the documents, the author of the documents, but also the audience of the documents. So we can observe this kind of work elsewhere. So what it shows us really is that the international community has a quite specific way to work in public discourse, right? It has a very specific way to create relationships, but also meaning. And we think that if we want to understand the political power of this concept, this is really something that we have to engage with. So during our research, Juliet and I, we really kept remarking to each other how well Bottici's concept actually allowed us to put all of our observations over time into context. Bottici states that myths are really best understood as a collaborative process. What they do is they provide a simplified version of otherwise really complex political events. They consist of a range of narratives that actors can tell and then retell when they encounter new situations, so to say, all of which shows that people don't simply subscribe to a myth, but they work on it, they invest in it, right? Another element that Bottici highlighted is that myths have this very dramatic element to it. She says, well, they tend to encourage actors, to motivate actors, and to assure them of the triumph of their cause, how she puts it. So when we think about the rhetoric really that accompanies liberal interventionism, not only in Cambodia, but really elsewhere, I think it's quite evident to what extent such a procedural view on the international community is relevant. So to summarize, what the idea of myth really allowed us to do was to show how this idea of an international community assigns actors with a role, with a purpose, how it continuously tries to integrate new events into a coherent plot, and how this then in turn shapes political realities on the ground, really.
Okay, thank you. Julie, now, and I think we're going to have to keep our questions quite short because we are running out of time, but I'm interested because your article is based on archival research, field research, and also interviews of various actors in Cambodia, United States, and Australia. Can you explain to us how the concept of political myth helped you to structure and guide your research?
Yes, thank you. So as Katrin mentioned at the beginning, this is the result of a joint conversation we had over several years. And so at the beginning, we had this initial approach that people we would interview in Cambodia would mirror the discourses of actors at the United Nations and speak of the international community in the same way as it is actively being portrayed by international actors. But then we noticed this apprehension towards the notion of the international community that I mentioned amongst specific groups of actors and activists. And so here it's really where the concept of the political myth helped us to reorganize the field research, structure interviews, and go back to the archival documents. And it helped us to do so, to look for first this collaborative element, so how actors collaboratively assign the international community with different actions and meanings over time, and how the idea comes to orient actors in a given political context. And then it also helped us to look for this cycle of telling and retelling of this political myth of the international community in Cambodia. So to look for how this process involves multiple subjects and to trace core narratives about the international community. And so we argue that these core narratives in the context of Cambodia have been about the international community being a watchful, caring entity, ready to act on behalf of the Cambodian people, to defend universal rights and intervene as a corrective to deviant political elite behavior. And so this effectively collapses the distance between Cambodians at the village or commune level and the international sphere, and frames local events as relevant to an ongoing political transformation in which the international community is actively invested in.
Okay. Katrin, in the conclusions of your article, you have said that your research has implications for scholars interested in the legacies of the liberal peacekeeping project. What are those implications? Can you elaborate a little bit?
Sure, thank you. So what we had in mind is that critical peacebuilding scholarship really has invested a lot of time and effort into questioning what we call problematic binaries or dichotomies, so local versus international, liberal versus illiberal, and how this has shaped thinking about change. So the scholarship also emphasizes how important it is, for instance, to attend to creative processes of interaction, how ideas emerge in the process. And there is an entire body of literature that emphasizes the importance of recognizing alternative notions, for instance, of timelines and temporality. So we think that despite all of this, in the middle of all this, we haven't really confronted the presence of the international community. In the early 90s, we have Kofi Annan, who stated quite distinctly, he said, well, the international community is the only way forward. It has an address, it has achievements. And we really think that this is still the concept that people have in mind. So there is still this strangely timeless actor, right? A powerful actor that has an address and these perpetually good intentions, so to say. There's also an incredible, teleological pull to the presence of this idea. So we think that we can actually show with our research the extent to which the international community is really intimately involved in creating these binaries, in fixing timelines, in rendering them natural and neutral. So as far as implications are concerned, we say that it's perhaps important to highlight that in the context of this entire academic project, it's not enough to simply say, well, we don't use the term anymore, we abandon it. We think that more substantially, what's really necessary is to take a look at the extent to which we already build on an entire history of the liberal peacebuilding project that assumes certain achievements and successes and failures, and that we construct this notion of a post-liberal order from there. So this is something that we would like to reconceptualize.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, so one final question to both of you, really. If you're out there and you're listening to this interview and you wanted to learn more, could you give us very, very briefly what you would say are the main takeaways of this article that might entice people in and to find out more? Julie, do you want to go first?
Yes, thank you very much. So maybe one of the exciting elements of this project is that we jointly looked at the political effects of narratives and portrayals of the international community over a prolonged period of time. And so we hope that this can show the value of moving beyond analyzing interventions according to their very specific mandates and the related delimited timeframes. So to move beyond this project logic towards attempts to trace the political effects of this idea over time in specific contexts. So that would be a takeaway from my side, yes.
Katrin?
Well, I think I just pick up on the last point I made. So I think we can show that there is a huge difference in conceptualizing, on the one hand, the history of the singular international community in Cambodia, and on the other hand, a multitude of histories of collaborative work on myth, so to say. To us, really, our research showed that one of the greatest shortcomings of what is probably the established vision of the international community, the established perspective on it, is that it takes this focus away from the concrete work of actors on the ground, the multitude of actors who have invested in this idea, who have created the idea, who have given life to this idea. And this investment is not only politically, it's also, as we stated at the beginning, it's also emotional investment. So we think that if we want to understand what defines actors' interests, their strategies going forward, it's really important to take the residue of these experiences, these concrete experiences into account. So we think that if we take this perspective seriously and if we apply this to other contexts, right, beyond Cambodia, we hope that there is something new to learn about transnational relationships, but also really about agency and power. Yeah.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you. Okay, well, we are running out of time. So thank you both very much for agreeing to be interviewed and giving us an insight into this research.
Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you very much.
For those of you who are keen to learn more, you can read the full article on the First View section of the RIS website. If you're a BISA member, you can access this free of charge as part of your membership. You just need to log on to your account at https://app.sheepcrm.com/BISA/login. If you're not a BISA member, you may be able to gain access through your institution. And while you're here, please do look at the BISA website, which is www.bisa.ac.uk, to learn more about us. And also you can learn all about the benefits that a BISA membership will bring you. Thank you once again to Julie and Katrin. It's really been a fascinating interview. So goodbye from me.
Thank you as well.
And goodbye from you too. Thank you very much.
Goodbye from Australia.